The mill stood on the northern edge of Detroit, its red brick walls stained darker with years of soot and unspoken grief. In 1898, it loomed like a cathedral to industry, with tall smokestacks rising above the clustered worker housing and the narrow alleys that funneled men and women toward its iron gates. The city was swelling with migrants from farms and distant ports, each one drawn by the promise of work. Yet it was here that so many quietly disappeared into statistics labeled as unfortunate accidents. To walk through the factory floor was to hear an orchestra of clattering machines, gears grinding against steel, belts snapping and reforming in endless motion. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with the rhythm of production, thick with coal dust that clung to hair and lungs. The overseers kept time with their watches, their voices carrying the same metallic authority as the machines. Every man knew that a misstep, a moment's hesitation could lead to disaster. But what unsettled the few who dared whisper in taverns at night was how often disaster seemed to strike, and how quickly the company was ready to move on. Dr. Everett Mallory, a physician who occasionally tended to injured workers, began to notice the patterns. The cases brought to him were not merely accidents of carelessness or fatigue. Too many of them bore the mark of deliberate neglect, safety mechanisms removed, guards left unlocked, instructions quietly altered. He began to suspect that what others called chance was, in fact, something far more intentional. It is as if, he wrote in his notes, the mill itself feeds upon those who labor within it, and the master gains strength from each sacrifice. The master, of course, was Edwin Harrington, owner of the mill. In public, he was regarded as a benefactor, a man who provided jobs and stability during a turbulent economic period. His suits were pressed, his speeches generous, and his name appeared frequently in church donations and charitable causes. Yet those who saw him on the factory floor described a different figure, a man whose eyes lingered too long on the machinery after an accident, as though calculating not loss but gain. What disturbed Mallory most was how swiftly the company resolved the deaths. Families received small sums, enough to quiet their grief, but never enough to provoke resistance. Death certificates listed vague causes: industrial mishap, mechanical failure, misadventure. No deeper inquiry was allowed. It was as though an invisible hand swept away the details before they could harden into accusations. The detective assigned to oversee the district, Jonas Keene, felt the unease as well. He was a man hardened by years of city crime, yet something about the mill unsettled him more than any alleyway murder. The accidents did not spread evenly across the city's factories. They clustered here within Harrington's empire, where each casualty somehow coincided with expansions, contracts won, or sudden financial windfalls. Prosperity follows tragedy, Keene muttered more than once, like vultures chasing death. But suspicion alone was dangerous. Harrington's reach extended into the city council, the police bureau, even the courts. To speak too openly was to risk not just a career, but one's life. And yet, the silence weighed heavier each month as another name was added to the tally of the lost. It was in the winter of that year, beneath the factory's rising smoke, that Mallory resolved to keep his own record, not just of injuries treated, but of every whispered detail, every overlooked mechanism, every shadow that passed across Harrington's eyes. He would write, even if no one yet dared to listen, for he sensed that what was unfolding inside that mill was not merely industrial misfortune, but the deliberate shaping of destiny by a man who had learned that death itself could be turned into profit. And then one night, a body was found outside the gates, one that should not have been there. The guards discovered him at dawn, crumpled against the iron fence as though he had been flung outward from the factory itself. His name was Elias Doyle, a machinist barely 23, known among the men for his careful hands and steady nerves. Unlike others who had perished within the roaring machines, Elias bore no crushed limbs, no torn flesh. His body was whole, his face calm, almost serene. Only the faint bruising around his neck betrayed something far more sinister. The company insisted it was a fall. They claimed he had stumbled from one of the upper walkways and tumbled against the gates in the night. Yet the men who worked beside him knew there was no walkway near that place. It was not a route he would have taken, not at that hour. Whispers began to stir in taverns, sharper now, less cautious. Elias had been silenced. Detective Jonas Keene stood over the body that morning, frost clinging to his mustache, and felt the air in his lungs turn to stone. The bruising was no accident. It was the mark of hands, deliberate, efficient, and sure. He said nothing aloud, only exchanged a look with the physician, Dr. Mallory, who had been summoned at dawn to make his own report. Between them passed an unspoken agreement. This death could not be written away so easily. Mallory noted the details in his private ledger. Subject Elias Doyle, strangulation apparent. No machine contact evident, likely foul play. Company claims accidental fall, implausible. The pen scratched harder than usual against the paper, the doctor aware that each word he set down carried the weight of a possible future reckoning. Outside the gates, wives clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders, murmuring to each other of curses and bargains. The mill seemed to them like a creature demanding offerings, and now it had taken Elias. The rumors found voice in hushed tones, stories that the owner himself walked the floors at night, choosing who would fall next. I wonder, as you listen, whether you've ever felt the press of silence around a truth too dangerous to speak. Perhaps you hear this while alone or while traveling through your own thoughts. If you feel that weight, you might leave a comment or subscribe, just so I know there are others who sense it too. Harrington's reaction was cold efficiency. Compensation was issued within hours, the widow taken aside and assured that her husband's death was the result of tragic mischance. The money pressed into her hand was more than she had ever seen, but the price of her silence was written in the tremble of her lips. She wept without words, while the overseer stood in shadowed silence behind her. Keene, however, could not let it pass. He followed the trail into the factory, walking the floors long after the men had gone, noting the locks, the angles of the railings, the paths of the machines. The more he examined, the more impossible the official version became. Elias had not fallen. He had been placed as though his body were meant to send a message or to erase one. Mallory, too, felt the unease growing into something more pointed. He remembered the way Harrington had stood at the edge of the gathering crowd that morning, his gloved hand resting on his cane, eyes cool and unwavering. Not grief, not anger, not even impatience, only calculation, as if he were already considering how the next accident would appear. And then, 2 nights later, another man vanished, his time card still hanging in place. The empty card swung slightly on its hook, as if stirred by an unseen hand. His name was Samuel Cutter, a quiet worker known for his punctuality. Men whispered that he never missed a shift, never left his card untouched. Yet when the bell rang at dawn, his slot remained bare of the notch he always made with his pencil. He had entered the mill, but he had not left. Detective Keene walked the floor with lantern in hand, its glow catching on riveted beams and rust-specked machines. The shadows of gears loomed around him like enormous teeth, and every corner of the mill seemed to conceal more than it revealed. His men searched the warehouses, the coal pits, even the banks of the nearby river. But Samuel had disappeared as though swallowed whole. The workers muttered that the factory devoured him, that his body had been ground down into dust among the machines. They dared not voice this too loudly, but their eyes carried the fear of men who felt trapped inside a monster that demanded their breath for fuel. Dr. Mallory, called again to observe, wrote in his ledger with growing unease, No remains, only absence. 2 incidents in succession suggest design, not mischance. He pressed his fingers against his temples as he considered the implications. If Elias's death had been staged to resemble an accident, then Samuel's disappearance was something altogether darker, a vanishing that erased even the possibility of cause. For Harrington, the owner, the timing could not have been more fortuitous. Days after Samuel vanished, the mill announced a new contract, one that promised vast profits from supplying steel parts for the expanding railway lines. Mallory noticed this pattern again. Tragedy coinciding with prosperity. Harrington walked through his factory with a calm, almost regal air, greeting men with a hand raised, but never speaking of the missing. It was as if acknowledging their absence would shatter the delicate illusion that all was well. In the taverns, suspicion grew louder. Some said Samuel had stumbled upon something he should not have seen. Perhaps documents, perhaps a hidden ledger. Others claimed he had tried to escape and Harrington made an example of him. Whatever the truth, the workers now cast glances over their shoulders with each clang of machinery, each echoing step in the corridor. Keene returned night after night, unable to dismiss the feeling that Samuel's body still lingered within those walls. He traced the machinery, the conveyor shafts, the grainy dark corners of storage rooms. He even lowered himself into the maintenance tunnels, where the dripping of water sounded like the heartbeat of something alive beneath the factory. Yet nothing emerged except silence, heavy and expectant. Mallory confided quietly to Keene that he feared they were witnessing not isolated tragedies but the emergence of a method, an orchestrated series of events designed to conceal intent behind the mask of inevitability. "It is not chance," he whispered. "It is choice." The detective agreed, but without proof, his words carried no more weight than the fears of the workers. The city officials remained loyal to Harrington's wealth, and to challenge him openly was to risk losing everything. Yet both men felt the same tightening in their chests, the sense that something was accelerating, that the pattern was only beginning. And then, on a rain-slick morning, Harrington himself was the one to discover a body, laid neatly at the center of the factory floor. The image unsettled even the most hardened overseers. The corpse of a man positioned with eerie precision beneath the great overhead crane. His arms were folded across his chest, his eyes closed as though he had been put to rest rather than left to decay. The rain from the night before had left a sheen upon the floor, making the figure glisten faintly under the dim lantern light. Harrington stood over him with his cane tapping the stone, not in alarm but in contemplation, as if this arrangement was both anticipated and somehow useful. The dead man was identified as Thomas Reeves, an older worker who had spent years mending the very machines that now hummed steadily around him. Unlike the bruised neck of Elias Doyle or the disappearance of Samuel Cutter, Thomas's body bore marks of deliberate restraint, rope indentations around his wrists and ankles, though no rope was left behind. He had been bound, held, and then placed here deliberately. Mallory, summoned to examine him, recorded it in his ledger with trembling hand. Clear evidence of calculated restraint, not accident, not misadventure, premeditation unmistakable. The workers gathered at the edge of the scene, their whispers carrying like a current through the cavernous space. Some swore they had seen Harrington enter the mill hours earlier, long before dawn, his tall silhouette cutting across the factory floor. Others insisted they had heard a low voice echoing through the machines, speaking words they could not understand. Theories swelled. Was Harrington staging these deaths to frighten them into obedience, or was something darker at play? Keene's suspicion hardened into certainty. This was no string of chance tragedies, but a chain forged with purpose. Yet he watched Harrington closely that morning, noting how the man's expression never faltered. When questioned, Harrington described himself as horrified, even grief-stricken. But his words lacked warmth, his tone precise, rehearsed. To the detective, it was the act of a man performing for an audience, concealing rather than revealing. Mallory, more reflective, found his thoughts drifting toward the nature of cruelty. It was not only the violence itself that disturbed him, but the patience behind it. The deaths unfolded not in chaos, but in order, each one more deliberate than the last. This was cruelty cultivated, refined, and measured. He recalled the Latin phrase he had studied in medical school, ars moriendi, the art of dying. Was Harrington practicing his own perverse version, turning the factory into a theater where death was both staged and commodified? The authorities, as expected, refused to challenge the official line. They ruled Thomas's death another tragic mishap, though the absence of machinery in the act made the explanation feeble at best. The men grew restless, their faith in safety shattered, their fear now accompanied by anger. A strike was whispered of, but each knew that rebellion against Harrington was as dangerous as the machines themselves. That evening, Mallory stood alone in his study, the rain tapping against the window, and considered the possibility that the killings were not merely for Harrington's enrichment, but for something more intimate. Control, perhaps even satisfaction. He had seen wealthy men before, but Harrington's gaze lingered differently, as though feeding upon the fear of others as much as upon their labor. And then one of the overseers came forward in secret, trembling as he confessed that Harrington had given explicit orders that ensured the safety locks remained disabled. The man's name was Fletcher, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes that darted about the tavern where he met Detective Keene. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the clatter of mugs and the murmur of workers, yet the words carried a weight that made Keene's pen tremble as he took notes. Harrington, Fletcher said, had insisted that the guards on the belt drives remain disengaged. He claimed they slowed production, and any man who tried to restore them faced dismissal. Fletcher swore he had witnessed Harrington himself, removing bolts that secured the covers, watching with clinical detachment as sparks leapt from the exposed gears. Keene pressed him for more, but Fletcher's nerve faltered. He kept glancing toward the door, as though Harrington's shadow might spill across the floor at any moment. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The accidents aren't accidents. They're arranged. He chooses who goes." The words seemed to break him, and before Keene could ask more, Fletcher fled into the night, vanishing into the narrow streets. When Mallory heard this account, it aligned with his own grim suspicions. He compared his notes. Elias strangled, Samuel vanished, Thomas bound. And now these revelations that Harrington deliberately compromised safety measures wove the incidents into something undeniable. What had seemed like isolated tragedies now revealed a pattern, one that mirrored known behaviors Mallory had studied in medical casework, the calculated progression of a predator refining his art. But what troubled him most was not only the evidence of intent, but the precision of escalation. Each death carried a different signature, as though Harrington were experimenting, testing how far he could push the boundaries without arousing official challenge. The doctor began to wonder whether the factory was merely a stage for something more personal, Harrington's own exploration of control, cruelty, and consequence. Still, the authorities remained unmoved. When Keene presented his findings to the commissioner, he was told bluntly that the city needed Harrington's mill, that contracts and jobs outweighed rumors and suspicions. Keene returned to his office seething, convinced now that Harrington's reach extended beyond mere influence into outright protection. The mill owner stood untouchable, cocooned by wealth and necessity. Yet among the workers, the truth began to take shape, like a figure rising from mist. Whispers hardened into certainty. Harrington did not simply neglect safety, he orchestrated danger. The factory floor was not just hazardous by nature, it was deliberately turned into a place where men were selected, consumed, and replaced. Fear spread through the ranks, not only of the machines, but of the gaze that watched them, measuring who would be next. Mallory's reflections grew darker. He began to see Harrington less as an industrialist and more as a strategist of death. "He treats lives as equations," Mallory wrote. "Remove a man and profit fills the void. Remove another and terror strengthens his hold. It is cruelty in the guise of commerce." One night, Keene received word that Fletcher, the overseer who had spoken, had been found lifeless in the river, his body snagged against the timbers of the dock. The death was ruled accidental drowning, but both Keene and Mallory knew the truth. Fletcher had spoken too freely, and Harrington had closed his mouth forever. And then, during a routine visit to the factory, Harrington turned to Mallory himself, his eyes cold, and asked a question that froze the doctor's blood. "Tell me, doctor, do you believe every life holds the same value?" The words lingered in the damp air of the factory like smoke that refused to disperse. Mallory stared at Harrington, unsure whether the inquiry was casual or calculated. The mill owner's lips curled faintly at the corners, but his eyes remained void of warmth, pupils like shards of obsidian. Mallory's instinct told him it was not a question but a test, a probing thrust to measure the depth of his convictions. "Yes," Mallory managed, though his voice carried a tremor. "Every life bears equal worth." Harrington tilted his head as if amused, his gloved hand brushing against the steel of a machine. "That," he replied softly, "is a belief convenient for priests and poets. But tell me, does the crippled hand of an aged worker yield the same profit as the strong back of a youth? Would you weigh their lives the same?" Mallory's silence betrayed him. He recognized the trap. Harrington was not asking for philosophy, but fishing for alignment. To answer carelessly was to declare loyalty or opposition. Yet even as Mallory sought words, Harrington's gaze drifted toward the machines, as if the matter were already settled in his own mind. Detective Keene, when told of this exchange, grew grim. "He's toying with you," he said. "He wants to know if you'll break ranks, and if you don't, he'll mark you." Mallory sensed the truth in that warning. Harrington's questions were never idle. They were instruments, each word designed to unsettle, to measure, to categorize. And now the doctor felt the shadow of danger creep closer, not just toward the nameless workers, but toward himself. Harrington's presence around the factory grew more direct. He no longer confined himself to his office, but prowled the floor, asking men peculiar questions in the middle of their shifts. "How quickly could you halt the press?" he asked one machinist. "If the belts snapped, who would you save first?" To another, "If two men were caught and you could free only one, whom would you choose?" The questions unsettled the men more than the accidents themselves. They were no longer treated as laborers, but as subjects in some private calculus of cruelty. Mallory recorded these interrogations in his notes, horrified to see a pattern. Harrington was not only orchestrating deaths, he was studying responses, testing moral boundaries like an experimenter with rats in a cage. Meanwhile, profits soared. The papers praised Harrington for his efficiency, calling him a pillar of industry. Contracts with the railways expanded and his influence deepened in City Hall. But in the shadows of the taverns and in the whispers of the workers, his name carried a different weight. Not benefactor, but butcher. Mallory confided in Keene one evening, the lamplight flickering between them. "He is no longer merely careless," the doctor said, voice tight. "He is deliberate. The deaths are not accidents of labor, nor even accidents of greed. They are questions, riddles posed to himself. with men's lives as answers. Keen's jaw tightened. Then the next question will be worse than the last. And Keen was right, for within a week, Mallory uncovered a hidden space beneath the factory, one that bore evidence of careful study, sketches of machines altered into traps, and notes scrawled in Harrington's own hand. It was Fletcher's whispered directions, remembered before his death, that guided Mallory down a narrow stairwell, concealed behind a stack of coal bins. The air below was damp, heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. The walls bore lantern marks where hands had steadied themselves countless times, suggesting that this space was no accident of architecture, but a chamber designed with purpose. Mallory lit his lamp, and the flame flickered across rows of shelves, stacked with ledgers, diagrams, and mechanical parts. At first glance, it looked like an inventor's workshop, a place where ideas had been tested before meeting the factory floor. But as he examined the papers, the truth became undeniable. The sketches were not improvements for efficiency, they were modifications for failure. Machines were redrawn with weakened joints, pulleys designed to snap under strain, and belts with calculated vulnerabilities. Each margin bore notes in Harrington's unmistakable hand, tested with Doyle. Observed panic, satisfactory. Mallory's stomach churned. These were not industrial drafts, but a record of cruelty, each accident premeditated and logged like experiments in a grotesque laboratory. The handwriting grew more frenzied with each page, revealing a man intoxicated not with profit but with control, the power to orchestrate life and death with the stroke of a pen. He carried some of the papers to Keen, who read them by candlelight with fists clenched tight. "This is the proof we needed," Keen said. "With this, no commissioner can protect him." Yet even as he spoke, his voice betrayed doubt. They both knew Harrington's influence was not so easily overturned. Wealth spoke louder than ink, and paper could be burned. Mallory pressed for immediate action, but Keen urged patience. "If we strike too soon, he'll bury it deeper. We need more, something undeniable, something that can't vanish with a bribe." Reluctantly, Mallory agreed, though every moment felt like another life balanced on the edge of Harrington's experiments. The doctor began to understand that Harrington's obsession was not merely with death, but with transformation, of chaos into order, of men into variables in his grand equation. The chamber beneath the mill was no archive. It was a mirror of his mind, structured and methodical, where human suffering was reduced to numbers and results. Mallory returned often in secret, documenting as much as he could, copying fragments of notes, sketching diagrams by hand. Each visit deepened his horror, yet also his resolve. But soon he noticed something chilling. The papers shifted between visits. Pages vanished, new sketches appeared. Harrington was still using the space, still refining his designs. It was not the past Mallory had stumbled upon. It was the present unfolding in real time. One night, as he crept back from the chamber with fresh copies tucked beneath his coat, Mallory felt the weight of eyes upon him. He turned sharply, lamp trembling, but saw nothing in the shadows. Still, the sensation clung to him, the certainty that Harrington knew someone had entered his sanctum, and that patience would not protect him much longer. And then, days later, Harrington summoned Mallory to his office, locking the door behind them, and placed a single torn page on the desk, a sketch Mallory himself had copied. The paper lay between them like a confession too dangerous to speak. Harrington's gloved finger tapped the margin where Mallory's faint pencil marks betrayed that it was not the original but a duplicate. His gaze lifted slowly, and the silence stretched so long that Mallory could hear the faint tick of the clock on the mantel, measuring out his dread. "You have been where you should not go," Harrington said at last, his voice low, almost tender. "Tell me, doctor, did you find it fascinating?" Mallory's mouth went dry. He forced himself to hold the man's gaze, though every instinct urged him to look away. "I found it disturbing," he answered carefully. A faint smile tugged at Harrington's lips. "Disturbing, yes. But you returned, did you not? Again and again. Disturbing, yet irresistible. You see, Doctor, curiosity is the purest hunger. Once it takes root, it devours everything else." Mallory realized then that Harrington was not merely accusing him. He was studying him, just as he studied the workers, testing boundaries, measuring reactions. The realization chilled him more than any threat. "You misunderstand me," Mallory tried, but Harrington cut him off with a raised hand. "Number Y, understand you perfectly. You want to believe you are different, that you observe without participating. But the act of watching is itself participation. You kept records, did you not? Diaries, notes, perhaps even sketches of your own?" His voice hardened. "Do not delude yourself into thinking you are outside of this. You are already inside my design." The doctor felt a tremor run through his chest. For the first time, he sensed that Harrington did not merely tolerate his presence. He welcomed it, as though Mallory's scrutiny provided an audience for his private theater of cruelty. When Mallory shared the encounter with Keene, the detective slammed his fist against the table. "He's playing with you. He knows you've been down there, and instead of stopping you, he's letting you twist in it. It's a game, Mallory. You've become part of his game." But the city remained unmoved. When Keene attempted to present the diagrams to a magistrate, the evidence was dismissed as technical misinterpretation, nothing more than theoretical drafts misunderstood by anxious men. Harrington's contributions to the railway contracts were praised instead, his reputation gilded by profit and necessity. Mallory understood now why no authority would act. Harrington was not just wealthy, he was indispensable. To dismantle him would be to cripple the city's industrial heart. The doctor's despair deepened, for if Harrington was protected by the very system meant to restrain him, then how could justice ever be reached? Harrington himself seemed to sense this protection. He grew bolder, speaking more openly of the expendability of men, his remarks cloaked as musings on industry. "A machine is only as strong as its weakest gear," he told a group of investors one evening. "Sometimes, gentlemen, one must allow the gear to break, so the engine as a whole may thrive." The men laughed, nodding, unaware or unwilling to see the truth beneath the metaphor. Mallory walked home that night with the bitter realization that the system itself had become Harrington's accomplice. And in that bleak clarity, another fear took root. If the law would not stop him, then Harrington would escalate unchecked, and those closest to the truth might soon find themselves among his chosen subjects. And then whispers began to spread that Harrington had set his sights not only on the workers, but on the families tied to them. The murmurs carried through the tenements like smoke seeping under doors, impossible to contain. Wives gathered in stairwells, clutching their children close, while men in taverns spoke with tight jaws of strange encounters after dusk. Some claimed they had seen Harrington's carriage lingering near the workers' row houses, its lanterns dimmed, its driver unmoving. Others told of questions Harrington asked, casual yet cutting. "Does your wife sew well? How many children? How often do you walk them home from school?" For the first time, the fear leapt beyond the factory walls. It was no longer only the men who felt the weight of Harrington's gaze, but the women and children whose lives existed far from the clang of steel. The unspoken bargain, labor for wages, risk contained within the mill, was shattering. Harrington's reach, it seemed, was boundless. Detective Keene received his first direct warning when a boy no older than 12 slipped him a folded scrap of paper outside the station. The message was brief, written in a trembling hand. "He watches us now. Please stop him The boy refused to give his name and fled into the alley before Keene could question him further. The detective unfolded the note again and again that night, feeling the gravity of its plea. It was not the fear of men, but the terror of children that pierced him. Mallory's despair deepened. In his private notes, he wrote of Harrington as though describing an illness spreading unchecked. At first confined to one limb, it now courses through the veins of the city. If left untreated, it will consume the body entire. He began to fear for his own household, imagining Harrington's cold eyes lingering on his wife or his daughter. The thought quickened his resolve, but also hollowed him with dread. The overseers, once silent, began showing signs of fracture. One, a burly man named Callum, confessed to Keene in hushed tones that Harrington had ordered him to collect addresses of workers' families. He said it was for insurance records, Callum muttered, but I knew better. He doesn't need their homes. He needs their fear. Within a week, Callum disappeared, his rooms stripped bare as though he had never lived there. The pattern of escalation was undeniable. Where once men vanished quietly into the gears of the factory, now the threat spilled into the open lives of the community. Harrington was no longer content with orchestrating deaths inside his empire of smoke and steel. He was probing the limits of control itself. Keene urged Mallory to prepare for the worst. If he's moved to the families, the detective said, he'll strike where it hurts most, and soon. He doesn't just want obedience anymore. He wants domination, and he'll get it unless we act. But Mallory's voice faltered when he asked the question that haunted them both. And how do we act, Jonas, when the law shields him? The detective's silence answered more than words could. It was not justice they would need now, but strategy, one that might risk everything to confront a man who thrived on orchestrating ruin. And then, late one evening, Mallory returned home to find his study disturbed, his ledger open on the desk, and a single note scrawled across its pages in Harrington's hand. I see you, Doctor, and I see them too. The words burned into him with a cold fire. He stood in the lamplight staring at the jagged script, the ink still wet enough to smear beneath his trembling fingertips. Harrington had been here, in his home, among his books, among the lives of his family. The invasion was not only physical but psychological, a message carved into Mallory's very sense of safety. No door, no lock, no hearth was beyond Harrington's reach. His wife found him there, pale and rigid, the paper clutched in his hands. He concealed the message from her, telling her only that work had burdened him. But that night, he lay awake, listening to the faint breaths of his daughter. Down the hall, haunted by the thought of Harrington's shadow lingering over her bed. He realized then that his role as observer, as chronicler of cruelty, had ended. He was now a participant, his family tethered to the fate of the factory. Detective Keene listened grimly when Mallory brought him the note. It's not just intimidation, Keene said. It's possession. He wants you to know he controls not only your thoughts, but your nights, your blood, your home. Keene paced the narrow office, the lantern casting sharp angles across his face. We need a counterstroke. If we wait, he'll tighten the noose. Together they began to review the evidence, not just the diagrams, not just the records of deaths, but the rhythm of events. Keene laid it out like a grim arithmetic. Elias strangled, Samuel vanished, Thomas bound, Fletcher drowned. Each life not simply taken but shaped into a demonstration, each method distinct, each escalation deliberate. It was not random, it was design. Harrington was testing boundaries, refining methods, cataloging results. Mallory, in his clinical way, framed it as though describing a contagion. He begins with chance accidents to establish a pattern of inevitability. Then he removes the disguise, one method after another, ensuring each is different. It is a study, Jonas. He wants to know what works, what terrifies, what silences. Keen muttered, and now he's turned to you. Which means the experiment has changed. You're not a worker to be crushed by a gear. You're the variable he wants to test in another way. The realization settled over them both. Mallory was no longer merely in danger. He was the subject of Harrington's next design. The note had not been a warning, but a declaration of intent. Still, Harrington's public mask remained polished. In church, he sat in the front pew, head bowed in piety. In newspapers, his name was lauded for donations to orphanages and schools. The city saw him as a savior, even as the undercurrent of whispers painted him as a predator. The dissonance was maddening, the contrast sharpened by every smiling photograph printed beside news of fresh contracts. Mallory wrote one final entry that night, his handwriting sharp with fear and resolve. If Harrington seeks to measure me, I must answer. But I will not be passive. I will turn the lens upon him. And so he prepared himself, not with weapons, but with words, with records, with truths carved into paper. He would confront Harrington not as prey, but as witness. And then before dawn, a fire broke out in the mill. Yet when the smoke cleared, the body found within was not a worker's, but someone far closer to Mallory. The charred remains were pulled from the blackened ruins of the machine floor, laid out beneath a torn canvas where the stench of burnt flesh clung to the morning air. When the fabric was drawn back, Mallory staggered, his breath catching in his throat. It was Henry Calder, his assistant, an earnest young man who had often helped transcribe notes and copy diagrams from the hidden chamber. The boy had been like an apprentice, eager, trusting, loyal. Keen gripped Mallory's arm to steady him, but his own jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene. There was no mistake. This was no accidental victim of fire. The placement of the body near a machine that had not even been active during the night suggested something far darker. It was a message, crafted with precision, delivered directly to Mallory. Harrington had struck not at his family yet, but at the young man who stood closest to his secrets. Mallory's mind reeled. Guilt clawed at him sharp as iron. It had been his own resolve to keep records, to fight back with truth that had drawn Henry into the orbit of danger. Now the boy lay as proof that Harrington's eye never missed, that every move Mallory made was countered with devastating efficiency. Later, in the dim privacy of Keen's office, the detective voiced the conclusion neither wished to speak aloud. He shifted his attention to you now, not the workers, not the overseers, you. Every death from this point will be tied to your steps. Mallory felt the truth in those words. The pattern had evolved beyond experiments on laborers. The cruelty had narrowed into focus, targeting him with deliberate escalation. Harrington was dismantling his resolve piece by piece, severing his supports, ensuring he would stand alone when the final blow came. But why keep him alive? That question haunted the doctor as he sat, sleepless, staring at Henry's name scrawled across his ledgers. Why torment him, but not finish the act? Unless the torment itself was the point. Unless Harrington sought to measure how long a man could endure the disintegration of all he valued. Mallory began to sense the weight of a survival dilemma pressing against him. If he stayed silent, others would fall, chosen at Harrington's whim. If he spoke too loudly, his family might be next. Every path spiraled into loss. Keen urged him to flee, to take his wife and daughter far from Detroit. But Mallory shook his head. He would follow, he whispered. Distance means nothing to a man who does not measure in miles, but in fear. He will hunt me because I see him, and he will not rest until he proves that seeing changes nothing. The detective understood, though the resignation in Mallory's voice chilled him. Harrington was not simply killing, He was orchestrating an experiment with Mallory as both witness and subject, trapped within a game where the rules shifted at the whim of a single man. And then, one rain-heavy night, as Mallory walked alone through the narrow street toward his home, he felt a shadow break from the alley and realized Harrington had finally stepped from theory into pursuit. The sound was soft at first, the scrape of a shoe against wet stone, but Mallory's pulse surged as though a thunderclap had split the air. He turned, lantern trembling in his grip, and saw the tall figure emerge, cane tapping against the cobbles, hat brim low, face cut by the glow of gaslight. Harrington did not hurry. He moved with the deliberate patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to flee. Mallory's breath caught, and for a moment he froze. Then instinct drove him backward, steps quickening as the rain poured harder, turning the street into a black mirror. Harrington's voice rose behind him, calm and steady even as the storm raged. "Doctor," he called, "you have observed enough. Now you must experience." Mallory broke into a run, heart hammering. The streets twisted like a maze, every corner spilling shadows that seemed to bend toward him. He thought of his wife, his daughter, the ledger that lay hidden in his desk, and knew this chase was not meant to kill him quickly. Harrington wanted him to run, to feel hunted, to live the terror his workers must have felt in their final moments. From the alley, mouths came sudden movements, shapes stepping out. Two of Harrington's overseers, their faces obscured by caps, blocked his path. Mallory skidded, slipping on wet stone, lantern shattering against the ground. The flame hissed into darkness. He stumbled, nearly falling, when another figure surged forward. It was Keene. The detective struck one overseer hard across the jaw, sending him sprawling into the gutter. "Run, Everett!" Keene barked, dragging Mallory back onto his feet. Together they forced their way past the second man, who swung a club that caught Keene's shoulder with a sickening thud. Pain twisted the detective's face, but he shoved Mallory onward, shielding him with his own body. Harrington's voice followed unshaken. "You cannot outrun inevitability. Even now, I am inside you. Your choices, your fears. You flee exactly as I calculated." The words pierced deeper than the rain. Mallory realized Harrington was not pursuing with the aim of capture, but with the satisfaction of proof that every reaction, every tremor of his body was part of an experiment coming to fruition. They burst into a narrow courtyard, gasping, their clothes soaked through. Keene pressed Mallory against the wall, forcing his voice low despite the pounding rain. "He's not after your death, not yet. He wants to break you. But we can turn this. If he thinks you're unraveling, let him believe it. We need to choose our ground, not fight on his." Mallory shook, torn between terror and resolve. Harrington's silhouette lingered at the far end of the alley, still as stone, cane resting like a conductor's baton before the final crescendo. For the first time, Mallory felt the full scope of the man's control, not merely over machines or workers, but over fear itself, woven like thread through every life he touched. And then, before they could retreat, Harrington raised his voice once more, cutting through the storm. "Next, Doctor, I will visit where you sleep." The words rang louder than thunder. Mallory staggered, not from exhaustion, but from the crushing certainty that Harrington's reach was already inside his home, threaded into the walls where his wife and daughter rested. Keene gripped his arm, forcing him onward through the slick, cobbled streets. Yet the doctor's mind reeled with images of his child's small hand, his wife's soft breathing, both under the looming gaze of the man who hunted him. By morning, the authorities intervened, not to arrest Harrington, but to contain the scandal. Mallory and Keene were summoned before a magistrate, questioned not about the threats, but about their conduct unbecoming against a man of standing. Within hours, Mallory found himself removed from the city's medical board, Harrington had not only reached into his home but into his livelihood, stripping away layers of identity until nothing remained but fear and helpless resolve. It was then that the state declared Harrington unfit, not as criminal but as patient. Pressure from the whispers and the growing unease among workers forced officials to act, yet they chose the path of least consequence. Harrington was confined, not to prison, but to a private institution on the city's edge, a place where wealthy men were treated with velvet chains and gentle supervision. Mallory attended the transfer, compelled by both duty and dread. Harrington stepped from his carriage in fine clothes, his cane tapping as though the ground itself bowed beneath him. His smile widened when his eyes met Mallory's. "You see, Doctor," he murmured, "they call this captivity. But it is only another stage, and stages need audiences." Within the institution, Harrington adapted with unnerving ease. He charmed attendants, conversed politely with physicians, and carried himself not as a prisoner, but as a guest. Mallory, visiting in his new role as outside consultant, observed the subtle ways Harrington exerted influence, arranging chairs before discussions, lingering touches on attendants' shoulders, words dropped with precision to plant seeds of doubt. The doctor noted in his journal, "Even confined, he orchestrates. He does not rage or plead. He insinuates. He bends others to him not through force, but through the gravity of his presence. He cultivates sympathy, weaving himself into the minds of those assigned to guard him." During one session, Harrington allowed tears to brim his eyes, speaking of loneliness, of misunderstood intentions. He described the factory as his burden, claiming he had been miscast as villain when he was merely a man trying to master chaos. His voice quivered, his hands shook, and several attendants shifted uneasily, already softening toward him. But Mallory saw through it. He recognized the performance, the feigned vulnerability, the careful timing of every tremor. Harrington was not confined. He was rehearsing. As Mallory left that day, Harrington called after him, his tone stripped of pretense. "Doctor, cages are only strong when the beast inside chooses not to test the bars." The words followed Mallory into the rain-soaked evening, where he could not shake the certainty that Harrington was preparing something even here, behind locked doors. And then, weeks later, a nurse was found dead within the ward, her fall from a staircase dismissed as accident, though her final duty had been tending to Harrington. The corridors of the institution smelled of bleach and damp plaster, yet the air carried a heaviness that no disinfectant could purge. The nurse's body had been discovered at the base of the north stairwell, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Officials declared it a misstep on slick stone, but Mallory, summoned again to observe, recognized the deliberate staging. Her shoes were dry, her posture too aligned, as though she had been placed rather than fallen. Among the staff, whispers spread like fever. Some swore Harrington had been speaking with her only hours before, his voice calm, persuasive, intimate. Others noted that she had confided unease in recent days, remarking that Mr. Harrington asks too many questions about my family, my fears, my dreams. Her sudden death then seemed less a coincidence than the predictable conclusion to a game he had played many times before. Mallory felt his stomach knot as he studied the attendants' faces. Already sympathy was shifting, suspicion turning not toward Harrington, but toward the nurse herself, as though her fall had been clumsiness, her unease hysteria. Harrington's influence bled into every corner of the ward, twisting perception until truth bent to his narrative. When Mallory entered Harrington's cell that evening, he found him seated with a small journal open upon his knees. The pages were filled with coded sketches, machines reimagined as anatomical diagrams, pulleys labeled with human names, gears etched alongside notations of fear. Harrington closed the book with deliberate slowness, smiling faintly. "Tragedy, is it not?" he said. "A woman so fragile, undone by a misstep. The world is cruel, Doctor, but cruelty is simply another form of order. You see it, don't you? The pattern. Each life a variable, each choice an equation." Mallory forced himself to ask, "And what equation did she solve for you?" Harrington's eyes gleamed. "The equation of loyalty. I needed to know how quickly the others would shift blame, how willing they were to abandon one of their own. And they did, Doctor. They always do. That is the beauty of it, the smallest nudge, and men reveal their nature." The doctor recorded the words later, his hand unsteady. "Harrington has transformed the institution into another theater. Within these walls, deaths continue, quiet, concealed, rebranded as mishaps. He experiments still, not with machines now, but with minds." Keene visited him soon. After, face drawn tight, he had intercepted fragments of the coded journal smuggled from the ward, each page bearing symbols that matched Mallory's notes. "He's not just writing, Everett," the detective said. "He's sending messages, blueprints, instructions, maybe even plans for beyond these walls. He's building something we can't yet see." The thought hollowed Mallory. Even confined, Harrington was expanding like roots splitting stone. The institution meant to contain him had become another engine of his cruelty. Nurses grew timid, attendants obedient, physicians doubtful of their own senses. Harrington thrived in their hesitation. And then, one night, Mallory received a package left at his door. Harrington's journal, its cover marked with a single phrase in ink that bled through the leather: "You are ready to understand." The weight of the book was heavier than its size should allow, as though the words within carried not just ink, but iron. Mallory opened it by candlelight, his hands unsteady. The pages bore diagrams more intricate than any he had seen before. Machines fused with human anatomy, levers marked with emotions, pulleys labeled with virtues and sins. Each drawing seemed less mechanical than symbolic, as if Harrington had transcended engineering and begun to map the machinery of the soul itself. Notes filled the margins in Harrington's sharp, angular hand. They spoke of experiments not only past but planned, sequences of manipulation, triggers of fear, methods of ensuring silence. Again and again, one phrase recurred: "Control is the essence. Death is only the final proof." Mallory read deep into the night, the candle guttering low until he reached the final pages. There, Harrington had written in larger, darker script, as if intended not just for himself, but for Mallory alone. "The machine is already built. Its parts are not steel, but men. Remove me, and it will continue. For I am not its creator. I am only the first to name it." The doctor felt a chill unlike any before. If these words were true, Harrington had not simply orchestrated deaths for profit or pleasure. He had modeled a system of cruelty, one that could live beyond him, carried in the choices of others who had learned from his shadow. When Mallory brought the journal to Keene, the detective's face hardened. "This isn't just confession," he said. "It's legacy. He's showing you how to continue what he started, or how others already will." Days later, the institution erupted in scandal. Harrington's cell was found empty, the bars intact, the locks unbroken. Some claimed bribery, others escaped through hidden passages, but no trace of him was ever discovered. The attendants insisted he had been calm the night before, speaking softly of redemption. By dawn, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his absence and the gnawing certainty that disappearance had been his final performance. In the weeks that followed, new accidents began to surface in mills across the state. Men crushed by gears that should have been safeguarded, women poisoned by chemicals mislabeled, children caught in collapses that inspectors had conveniently overlooked. The names changed, the cities shifted, but the rhythm felt familiar. Mallory could not escape the sense that Harrington's words were proving true, that the system itself had absorbed his cruelty, that others were now enacting the same grim equations under different names. Whether Harrington still lived, orchestrating from the shadows, or whether his design had taken root on its own, remained uncertain. But the fear lingered. The doctor wrote his final entry with trembling hand. "Evil is not a man, but a method." Harrington taught us this. If he lives, he thrives unseen. If he is gone, his shadow remains. The true terror lies not in his presence, but in the certainty that someone, somewhere, is already learning his art. And so the question remains, not whether Harrington escaped, but whether he ever needed to. For perhaps the murder mill of Detroit never closed at all.